do you need to see those rates come down, do you think, before anybody gets relief? How reliant are you on seeing those rates come down?
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. The Liberal cabinet retreat is happening in Montreal right now, and contrary to previous press conferences, reporters weren't accepting the usual non-answers from Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, and she seemed shocked that her usual tactics weren't working.
Let's take a look.
Freeland, can you please clarify how many businesses have paid back CEBA loans with their own money versus through refinancing through banks? Can we get that separated number rather than the global number?
So I'm going to let our Minister for Small Business start with the reply, and then I'll follow in as desired. Richie, to you.
For sure. Thanks for the question. Before I answer that, I just want to say thank you to all the small businesses who did the right thing to keep Canadians safe and then continue to remain resilient and to persevere through some very challenging times. With that, I can answer that small businesses have been able to approximately, or we've estimated about 75% have been able to pay back.
And how many of that was refinanced through banks, and how many of that paid back the loan themselves?
As soon as we were able to finalize some of those numbers, we'll be sure to be able to share that, including the breakdown between the two.
First question.
Translation.
And they're already trying to skirt around it.
Translation is we don't know.
We don't know. Don't know.
Or I suppose the other translation could be we don't want to tell you that number.
Yeah, so this is the thing that always bothers me about this whole thing. Because the government's enforced lockdowns on businesses and everybody, it kind of forced them to give up their income. And then the government came in, like they have been, so they create the conditions where you must rely upon them. And so they said, here's some money. And if you want it, you have to apply for it, and it becomes, a loan. Okay, fine. And then when businesses are then said you have to, repay back, a portion of that loan, there's a lot to CEBA that we're not going to go into because it's way too detailed for this video. But needless to say, they had to pay back a not insignificant amount of that loan. And they had until last week to pay it back or refinance it. So the question is a really good one from the reporters, because they're like, well, how many small businesses actually paid back their loan with their money versus having to refinance it? And the response was, well, 75% of small businesses have tried to repay or have repaid back the loan. They didn't want to talk about it. Because how much do you want to bet that the percentage of small businesses that couldn't pay back that loan and had to pay it back with refinancing, meaning they had to get a loan from somebody else to actually pay back that loan, is incredibly high. This is the problem here. So congrats, you've paid back your CEBA loan, but now it's another loan that you still have to pay back. And it's going to be held over their head for who knows how long now. So, this is just another way Freeland and the Liberals are exterminating small businesses in this country.
You don't have it right now.
Not at this time, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Prime Minister, does your government have a delivery problem? Over the years, there's been a lot of money put on the table, Canadian Infrastructure Bank, Housing Accelerator. It's not always gone out the door efficiently. It's not always gone out the door. It's not always been spent. It's not always been tracked. Do you have a delivery problem? And if so, how do you fix it?
Very nice.
You have a delivery problem.
That's one way to put it, I suppose.
Just start throwing out terms and guarantee they have a problem with that. That's the way this Liberal government's gone. Yeah, they have a delivery problem. They say, hey, we have all this money and we're going to spend it on stuff. And then they don't spend it. It never happens. The Housing Accelerator, allegedly there was $4 billion there for 3 years, something like that. Nothing made it out the door. And then they took, Mr. Immigration himself, who lost 1 million people.
Can the minister please tell us, glasses, binoculars, or otherwise, how you lose 1 million people?
And then they said, I know, you can fix the housing problem that you saw, that you started.
Well, Cypher, didn't you know that housing is not a primary federal responsibility?
Oh, this is true, allegedly. So, yeah, they have a problem, with the speed with which they spend money, and they have a problem with the amount of money they spend.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Canada Growth Fund, which we announced in the 2022 budget. And we already now have had the first major investment by the Canada Growth Fund, and then the first contract for difference delivered by the Canada Growth Fund, both of those this fall. That is really, really fast action. That is complicated. The Canada Growth Fund contract for difference that we announced, an investment in Entropy in Calgary, that is the first contract for difference on a carbon price of its kind. It is up and running. It is happening in Canada. It is not happening anywhere else in the world. And let's talk about the Housing Accelerator Fund. Again, really, really complicated. And that is now up and running. We have deals. We are announcing every single week a new deal with a new municipality. We've announced deals with the biggest cities across the country. And that is on track to deliver hundreds of thousands of homes for Canadians. And I actually misspoke on the Canada Growth Fund, because that was actually first announced in the 2023 budget. And it is already delivering investments in Canada.
I find it just bizarre that she brings up the Housing Accelerator Fund. You know when that was announced? In the 2021 election. 2 years ago. Almost 3.
Well, and nobody even really knows what it does. All she says is, well, it's really, really complicated.
Right. Why? Tell me why it's complicated. This is basically the nuts and bolts of the Housing Accelerator Fund. They wait for cities to come and say, hey, we have a plan to build houses. And then the federal government says, great, here's some money. That's the bare bones of what the Housing Accelerator Fund is. We don't know what that money's for, but we can sure as heck tell you it doesn't contribute to building houses.
When it comes to housing affordability right now, how much of the problem do you think is just persistently high interest rates? And do you need to see those rates come down, do you think, before anybody gets relief? How reliant are you on seeing those rates come down?
That was a pause.
Yeah, she's probably trying to figure out what the question means and how she can kind of snake her way around it.
Yeah, so basically, the question is essentially, how reliant is your government on interest rates actually coming down to be able to provide some sort of relief to Canadians? And to me, it's almost a backhanded way of saying, so you have no plan on reducing costs for Canadians. So you're just waiting for interest rates to come down so that, some people with variable mortgages or people that are going to be renewing their mortgage are going to get some relief.
But not only that, think about how much money the government is wasting on their debt. So if interest rates are high for the government as well, then that's more of our money that they're spending to service that debt. If interest rates come down, then that's less taxpayer money that's being wasted on interest payments.
Right. And right now we're paying around $40 billion a year just on interest. That's disgusting. Think of what we could do with $40 billion. So this is an interesting question.
Absolutely recognize that inflation has been a real challenge for Canadians, and I think all of us are glad to see inflation has come down from its peak of 8.1% down to 3.4%.
Time out. All right. Those of you that have watched our 1984 live stream episode, it's still around. This is directly an Orwellian talking point. So if you haven't read 1984, if you haven't seen the movie 1984, please go watch it. One thing they talk about there is doublespeak. And it's essentially giving your brain two conflicting pieces of information, and it confuses your brain just to accept both of them. So one of the things that they talk about in the movie and in the book is chocolate. So one of the things that they measure is the amount of rations you get in chocolate, right? Because the government gives you everything, you own nothing. So this analyst is looking at, the ration reports, and it goes from something like 60 grams down to 40 grams a month. So in order to show that the government, is doing a great job, he amends that news report to say chocolate rations have increased to 40 grams a month. Doesn't say what from, but everyone is just forced to accept it. They think, the brain says, wasn't it higher? It must have been. Well, I guess it's not higher because the government is telling me it's increased. So it must have been lower before. Okay, yay government. This is exactly what Chrystia Freeland just did.
Well, and this is also part of the BITE model. The I stands for information. So when cults or authoritarian governments control the information exactly in this manner by telling you, oh, well, it's decreased since the peak. That's incorrect. The problem is inflation is still going up. It's not actually decreasing. What's decreasing is the rate of increase, if that makes sense. So before it was, 8.6, she said was the peak. And now for the last month, for December 2023, inflation was 3.4%. That doesn't mean it's gone down.
So let's take a look. So this is a graph showing the average inflation rate and the Bank of Canada interest rate from January 2018 to November 2023. What's Christina Freeland talking about? Or Christina Freeland talking about? This. She's talking about the peak inflation rate was at 8.1%. Okay? And she is saying, oh, well, it's come down from the peak. Okay, well, obviously, if you're talking about the peak, then anything after the peak, it's down because that was the peak. The problem is she hasn't talked about June. June, the inflation rate was at 2.8%. That was when Chrystia Freeland and the Liberals declared victory that their economic plan was working. What happened after June? It went up to 3.3%. What happened after that? It went up to 4%. It came down to 3.8%, came down to 3.1%, stayed at 3.1%, and then in December, it went back up to 3.4%. Now, if you don't believe this, let's look at CP24. CP24, headline, annual inflation rate accelerates to 3.4% in December, complicating path for Bank of Canada. Chrystia Freeland would have you believe that this is a good thing that's happening. It's down from the peak, 3.4%. That's it. And here, we can show you here, the Consumer Price Index. Now, Consumer Price Index. Some of you may have heard of this, some of you may not, but it's really, really important.
This is essentially our measure of inflation. So if you look at the peak, again, inflation was 8.1%, and now it's quote unquote down to 3.4%, but it's not going backwards.
Right.
Things are still increasing in price.
Just not at that rate.
Right, just not as fast. So instead of increasing month over month at 8.1%, now it's increasing at 3.4%. So it's still going up. It's not going backwards. It's not going down.
So with all this talk about interest rates, we felt it was really important that you know what the Consumer Price Index is. So we found a little bit of media on this.
The Consumer Price Index, commonly referred to as the CPI, is a measure of the rate of average price change for goods and services bought by consumers in Canada. The CPI is the most widely used indicator of inflation. Imagine a shopping basket. Fill the basket with things that you and other people in Canada might buy. Now track the cost of this exact basket over time. The change in the cost of the basket is a basic illustration of pure price change, which is what the CPI measures. The CPI basket includes all goods and services purchased by households in Canada. The groceries you buy, the electricity and water rates you pay, the haircuts you get, the hotels you stay in, and much more. Each item in the basket receives a relative importance, or basket weight, that represents the proportion households spend on each item. For example, a much larger share of Canadian spending goes to gasoline than to milk. Therefore, gasoline will receive a larger weight than milk in the CPI basket.
So that's a 60-second overview of what the Consumer Price Index is. So think of it like this. When you get on an airplane and the plane is taking off, it is accelerating forward, but it's also accelerating upward to get you off the ground. Now, you can kind of think of that as inflation, right? So as the plane is climbing to its peak altitude, it is climbing at its fastest rate. So that's your 8.1% peak inflation that we were just talking about. As it rises and is approaching its peak altitude, the rate of climb decreases. The plane's still climbing, but it's not climbing as quickly. So that's what happens when inflation goes down. Prices don't go down, but as Fox said, just the rate at which they increase goes down. So they're still increasing, just not as fast. So let's get back to the Consumer Price Index. So as you see right here, we have December had a 12-month change of 3.4%. But there's other indicators of that. Food purchase from stores was at 4.7%.
That's a lot.
Carbon tax, anyone? Shelter, housing, 6%.
Well, yeah, if there's more people who need homes and there's not more homes, of course the price is going to go up. It's supply and demand.
Transportation, 3.2%.
Carbon tax again.
Carbon tax. So all of that contributes to the overall inflation rate of 3.4%. Okay? And here's the other thing. I think the Liberals are relying on the slowing economy to help bring interest rates down, because that's one thing, that happens when you go into recession. Interest rates come down, inflation goes down, because there's not as much money being pumped into the economy. And what's happening right now, contrary to the Liberal belief, the Canadian economy is shrinking. Specifically, the service economy. It's gone down for the 7th straight month. But the Liberals keep saying, oh, we have all these new jobs. It's great. One stat that they keep throwing out is we have 1 million more jobs now than we did prior to COVID. Yeah, well, we've also imported how many people since then? So this is the real numbers, folks. Again, numbers don't lie. 2020 to 2021, 226,000 and change new people came into Canada. The next year, 493,000. The next year, 468,000 people. That works out to over 1.1 million new people.
Almost 1.2.
That have come into Canada since COVID, which is what Chrystia Freeland loves to keep saying.
And that doesn't count for 2023.
Right. We don't even know. We don't have the numbers yet from 2023 to 2024 yet. And she's bragging about the fact that we've added 1 million new jobs. Okay, so let's just say, fine, I grant you that. What about the other extra 200,000 people?
And those are just the ones we know of. Again, we don't have the numbers for last year yet. It's too early in 2024 to have those numbers.
And this doesn't take into account students that have come in internationally, which they have just admitted this week that they're cutting by 35%, despite the fact that only a couple months ago, they called them a lucrative asset.
Yeah, and it's 50% reduction in Ontario.
If anything, the unemployment rate is higher because there's 1 million more people in this country. So there's all of this double talk and all of this smoke and mirrors that she's using, but we're not having it, which is why we are giving you all of these facts so you can stay informed and understand what the heck is really going on with this economy.
I think all Canadians also recognize the challenge that high interest rates are posing. As inflation comes down, that is something that we want to support because we do see interest rates are posing a challenge for Canadians.
Sorry, can you just, I didn't actually hear a clear answer on whether you think that interest rates are one of the key drivers of housing unaffordability right now.
Oh, snap.
And that was a different reporter, folks.
Well, and did you see Freeland just kind of like smile and try to weasel her way out of it?
Yeah, she's like, oh, crap. All right, what do I do now?
One of Canada's fundamental strengths is the strength of our institutions. And actually, that has been recognized in the recent reports of ratings agencies that have reaffirmed our AAA rating. And as part of that reaffirmation, they have talked about the strength of Canada's institutions, which is a distinguishing factor in the world right now. One of our core economic institutions is that we have an independent central bank that independently sets interest rates. We recognize that.
But if interest rates, as I understand from economists, them being up won't actually alleviate house prices because it's a supply issue that are driving house prices up. But they are contributing to house prices being even more unaffordable. Do you believe that having a high interest rate environment is still necessary, given that in other areas of the economy we're seeing deflation?
Not having it, folks. The reporters are not having it.
Nope, they did their homework.
And the thing I like about this is the first reporter asked the question, and other reporters are thinking, okay, either that was on my list to ask, or that's a great question. Can't wait to get the answer to it. And then she doesn't answer, and they're like, no, you didn't answer the question. Answer the question, please. Okay, let's talk about institutions. Okay, what are you saying here? You didn't answer the question.
Well, and again, she goes on about Canada's AAA credit rating. That does not matter to citizens. That's a government thing.
Well, and then she went on to talk about the institutions, and Bank of Canada sets the interest rate. What's your point? That has nothing to do with the question.
Right, and the government still lays that framework for the Bank of Canada to set those interest rates. If the Bank of Canada sees that the government is causing a recession, then they're more likely to lower interest rates. If the Bank of Canada sees that government policies are causing inflation, then they're more likely to raise the interest rates.
Right. And the reporters are very in tune to what is going on in terms of affordability right now, because that's what Canadians are most upset about. So, they're seeing this. They're seeing this trend. And the mainstream media is also seeing that their audience is shrinking. So they better actually report on the stuff that Canadians want to hear about.
We all absolutely recognize the challenge that high inflation has posed for Canadians. And I think all of us in our professional capacities and just as human beings are glad to see that inflation has come down from its peak of 8.1% to 3.4% in December.
There she goes again. Recognize it whenever she says this stuff, folks, and you will be able to cut through the BS. When she says those tropes like that, it's come down from the peak. Your BS meter should be, going off and sounding the alarm.
That is a relief for Canadians. It is really important. Our government has been and is committed to supporting the Bank of Canada in the work of ensuring that inflation can come down so that interest rates can come down as well. Because we do recognize, as does every single Canadian, that high interest rates are a challenge. They're a challenge for a business looking to invest. They're a challenge for a home builder looking to build more homes. They're a challenge for a young Canadian looking to buy a first home. And I think that's really elementary and obvious to all Canadians.
This is the third cabinet
retreat, at least in a row, where you've said that affordability and housing prices and inflation are sort of your key topics of conversation. A year later, at least, with 3 cabinet retreats, Canadians don't seem to be buying whatever message you're selling on it. Why are Canadians not believing that your government has the solutions?
Wow.
That was savage.
And the other thing I heard in the background was a staffer yell, "Last question."
I'll bet.
But oh man, love it.
Well, and Freeland was just loving how they were all clamoring, trying to ask the next question. But
I'm so important.
Yeah, and did you see how fast her face fell when that reporter asked that question?
Oh yeah, yeah. She's like, "Oh my God, this is what Justin must have felt like in that Global News interview with Mercedes." That'll be short, everybody.
You're right. This has been an incredibly challenging economic period, and it's one of the things we've spoken about. And I think all of us need to step back a little bit and look at the economic roller coaster our country and all of us have been through since COVID first hit. This is now nearly 4 years ago, right? So COVID hit beginning of 2020, and we shut down our economy, really for the first time in world history. And we were thrown into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Think back to our predictions then. Think back to the fears, legitimate fears we all had of deep economic scarring, of the pain you would get from prolonged unemployment. That was shock number one. Then you had shock number two, which was the shock of the reopening of our economy. And we had all of the supply chain challenges in the world, because it wasn't only our economy being reopened, it was the global economy. And that was exacerbated by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Oh my God.
Oh, he's got his glasses off, folks. He only does that when he's incredibly frustrated. I know you can't see it, but I can.
Anything but the Liberals. Absolutely anything but the Liberals here, folks. So first I'm going to blame COVID, then I'm going to blame the rest of the world, then I'm going to blame the recession, then I'm going to blame Putin, then I'm going to blame the war. And half of this stuff wouldn't have happened if you guys actually did your jobs.
Well, that's it. It's not COVID's fault. It's the fact that you guys mismanaged that so badly that you destroyed our economy, that you destroyed supply chains, that you destroyed jobs.
Now, I will give a small piece to her. You can't control what other countries do, right? We can all agree on that. So if another country chooses to shut down their whole industry, and that means that they're not producing computers, they're not producing rubber, they're not producing just all of these other components and goods that we need, then yeah, our supply chain is going to be affected by that. Which is why the Conservatives are talking about opening more businesses here in Canada, so we're more reliant on that stuff.
Well, and that's exactly it. Working in the veterinary field, I learned pretty quickly that there's only like 2 places in the entire world, sometimes even one, that produce specific medications. And if something happens at one of them, then you're in huge trouble. Years and years ago when I was in school, they stopped producing diazepam, which is something that's used for anesthesia. And there's one company in Canada that was producing them, and they shut down their factory for expansion, and they thought they had stockpiled enough, and they didn't. And all of that medication then was prohibited from veterinary use. It went straight to the human market because they use it in human anesthesia as well. So there's like only one place sometimes that produces a specific thing in the world. And it's not often in Canada. So when they're having supply issues in a different country and we're reliant on that other country, there's nothing we can do.
And this is the one thing I have I would like to say to Liberal voters. I know Liberal voters probably haven't, made it this far into the video, but that's okay. If you have a government that is tasked with solving affordability, and it's the third cabinet retreat in a row that they said this is our priority, and it's evident they haven't done anything over those 3 cabinet retreats, which is probably about 18 months. And you have them standing up and saying, well, it's not our fault because it's this and that and this and that and this and that and this and that. What that translates into is our government is unable to correct this. And what does that mean? You need a new government that can.
You're right.